Welcome to episode 24 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage your global websites. In our last episode, we discussed why it's important for CEOs to ask questions and covered the various KPIs and key factors startup CEOs should be focusing on to make sure that their organization is measuring the right stuff. Whether you're a CEO or you're on the digital team, I suggest you check that out. Just do a search for International Web Effectiveness CEOs. In this episode, we're going to discuss why SEO should be looked at as a team sport. When teams collaborate, SEO efforts become stronger, more effective, and more successful. But before we get into that, I want to discuss the latest SEMrush article. It was called Investigating ChatGPT Search, Insights from 80 Million Clickstream Reports, and this was by Brianna Kelly. This was really interesting. Bill, have you had a chance to take a look at this?
I did. Yeah, I thought it was interesting as well. I think they did a good job of sort of breaking it down, like what's happening with sort of the, these AI searches, ChatGPT and that. And then one of the interesting things they broke out was, it was interesting that they could see it in the clickstream data, was whether or not people had enabled ChatGPT search feature, where it would bring in results like from search engines and things. Some of the insights were pretty fascinating. And I don't want to steal any of your thunder. So any of the key things that you picked up on that you think people should take a look at this?
Yeah, there was a bunch of things. Like when I use chat, I find myself asking things I'd never type into Google. A study showed 70% of queries are new intent types. And, we might be witnessing the death of a keyword-based search. But here's what's wild. When users disable the search function, their prompts balloon to 23 words on average, nearly 5 times longer than when search is enabled. And it's not just Q&A. It's like problem solving at the search engine. And I don't know about you, but I find myself doing the same exact thing. I will work on my prompt 2 or 3 times to the point where I just want the answer. I don't want to have to click anything. Right. And most of the time it works for me.
Yep. No, it's the same. And I think that a lot of times maybe when people are using these answer engines, they're really trying to solve things. And that was one of the things that they looked at, was this intent. That 70% that you reference, I wrote a separate article on should you need a VP of answers, which we'll talk about on a future episode. And I actually talked about this. This came out like an hour before I was ready to publish that article. And I actually took that 70% and said, I don't know that because they sort of build it as these are intents we don't know or we've not seen before. I thought, well, if you've got between a 23 word and 2,000 word prompt, I think it's funny now that we talk about the rudimentary ways that we've identified intent. I just think that it's too simplistic for that, when you've got that many variables that it's mining through. So I think that's more of why it was there. But what was interesting is that when people intent was the big takeaway for me was exactly, it went up to like 52%, I think it was, for informational queries, exactly as what you said you do. You want the answer. You want to know something, and more than just like I caught myself, my daughter was on a trip to India and asking like, what time is it in New Delhi? And you can ask that of Google and it will actually tell you what time it is. But those kind of things, right? I was just doing a query on, what are things that we should eat in Azerbaijan? And then what are versus popular. And so it was very interesting. I found myself going, to Perplexity or ChatGPT and doing that query, mainly because I wanted a little more information than what Google will produce. Oh, that's potentially a commercial query. Let's show you a bunch of restaurants. The sad thing was it gave me a bunch of restaurants like in New York City, as opposed to like giving me the food that I was looking for. So very, very interesting, that point. And then I think the point you made that was fascinating that they call out was that whole thing that when people turn on search to bring in the external, they immediately revert back to those, I think it was point 0.1 word queries. So more typical of a Google type query. And I'm wondering, is that because they wanted to tease out results from the search engine that they had to refine it to that level? Refining meaning going from 23 words down to, say, 4.1 word or 4.2. I thought that was really interesting. Another one that they called out in the study was similar to the pills that Google's pulling up when you do a query, the different things. They're presupposing, like in ChatGPT, it says, what can I help with? Create an image, make a plan, help me write, surprise me, brainstorm. So it's sort of having you almost in a way tell it what you want to do. And so those capabilities obviously far exceed what traditional or conventional search can do. So I thought that was really interesting on how they were pulling that out. And then they had interviewed a variety of people, Mike King, Chris Long. He sort of parroted something he said. I want to get him in here. Aleda, they talked to, oh yeah, Kevin Indig.
Yeah.
That was one about the AI side of this. One thing he pointed out, which Motoko wrote in an article that she has coming out soon, was about first mover advantage in emerging markets with, these AI search things. So again, I think it was fascinating research that tied directly into some of the things we've been talking about lately.
Yeah. Kevin also talked about LMs will soon develop their own weighting algorithms. I think that might be part of the solution for your location. So I saw a really good snippet of like a 4-hour video where someone was showing how they actually crawl and get the information for the LLMs. And what this showed was they basically strip out everything. So they're just looking for the words.
Right.
You could infer that schema has no bearing on chat results, and maybe location has no bearing on chat results. So I think they're going to have to start doing stuff in order to be competitive with Google in that sense. And I saw another thing from Michael King where he showed branded search results and the companies that were winning and how they were winning. And the companies that were winning had like no format at all. It was just a text page with the list of other brands in a listicle. And so they basically wrote the article, what are the top 15 SEO companies in the United States as an example. And the companies that were ranking all had these really simple listicle pages. So, LLMs are just scraping that text and using that as answers. Has no bearing on, weightings and algorithms.
Right. At this point, there's logic and because again, it's still very probabilistic, that if you got A, then the next sequence is B, C, D, and E. One other interesting thing that was in that research that you touched on, sort of going back to sort of Mike King, and what he did is the websites that were getting a lot of referral traffic weren't necessarily some of the biggest sites. I think I was just trying to scan this to find that stat. The 10,000 most visited domains after ChatGPT interactions were, and again, this makes sense to me on who uses this, online services, education, mass media, because a lot of times people will click through or they'll then requery, if there's a news article or something, especially a lot of these were research, but they were talking about some sites that you wouldn't expect to be in there. It was like traffic, they're not in like the top 1,000, let's say, for regular Google traffic, but they were one of the big winners in, say, traffic coming from say ChatGPT. This was all ChatGPT. So I thought that was really interesting that we've got this new set of winners, if you will, and I think that's what it is that they're ticking these relevancy elements that the LLMs and these tools are using to pull back data to present to you what they think is the right result. So I think, it's upending a lot of things, which I think this research and the findings and how you can sort of extrapolate from it in a way, tees up nicely into what we want to talk about today, which is actually an outtake of our last episode where we were telling CEOs that they need to, sort of make search KPI part of everybody's KPIs. And so it's interesting, how sometimes these articles can fit perfectly into what we were planning on talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's get into the main topic. So imagine building a football team where only the quarterback knows the rules of the game. That's essentially how most organizations approach SEO today. They treat it as a niche skill set only known by the marketing teams while everyone else plays in the dark. But what if the secret to dominating rankings isn't hiring better quarterbacks, but teaching the entire team how the game works? And that's what we're here to talk about today. And Bill, you were on fire. You wrote another article on this exact topic. Why don't you describe the article?
Yeah, it's called SEO is a Team Sport. And then it's a subhead integrating search optimization across departments. And it was really the first of a series on the how do we do what we told people to do last week. We told the CEO, hey, go ask these questions of these people. And that's really what this article is doing. It's how do we move from what we call, an individual contributor sport. I was trying to think of a way to bring it back to sports. I guess maybe you're a pole vaulter. Nobody else, it's just you in the pole. And, it's you against that bar. And whereas if you're on the track and you're running a relay race, yeah, you can have a great sprinter at the end to take up any slack. But why do we put the fastest runner at the end? To make up the slack for anybody else that failed to run their best for whatever reason, right? So it's similar back to the quarterback. They get all the credit and stuff like that. So that's sort of where I was going with this, is this idea of we can't have our startup CEOs knocking on everybody's door asking for these data points if these people collectively aren't working together. And I think you said this, a lot of SEOs for preservation reasons often will hoard this knowledge.
So that's a point I don't think people realize the context. But you were describing your frustration with people not willing to bring in other people to help with SEO, right? Was that the original?
Yeah, so we were talking about the one paragraph that I thought was going to rile people up. I called Why Reactive SEO Falls Short. And the premise of this was, SEO is often brought in after. So we're reacting to something, right? Dev decides we're going to do relaunch a new code pack. We're going to do a new template. We're going to UX changes our menu structure. Something happens. Search is totally blindsided by it and then have to come in and fix it.
Yeah, so we're running around fixing defects instead of SEO as a quality control before it even gets to us.
Exactly. And even more simply and fundamentally is wired in. If we're going to do a template, why isn't search wired in?
Yeah, and it's funny, I'm just thinking about this now, but 50% of my tickets are fixing things that other people screwed up, not stuff that wasn't done or wasn't thought about, but was broken because they fixed something else and they didn't know what the standard should be.
And I think that's key, right? They did not know. And the analogy that whenever I do training for managers and for developers, I always use the same example. If we have a page that's no longer, we've done something to it, and now the page is over here. So page A is now page B. If we give a task to a developer and say, page A is now page B, they have 6 methods in their toolbox that they can take users who are expecting to go or are being directed to page A to page B. 6. Out of those 6, only 1 is really optimal for search. And I'm not going to get into the pissing contest with SEOs that I'm not even going to go there. Let's just agree 1 is better than the others. Some of those that are actually easier to implement, like 0-second refreshes or some JavaScript redirects, are actually the easiest for a developer. So when you give a developer carte blanche and they've got a toolbox of tools, they're probably going to use the one in the absence of knowledge that 1 is better than the other 5, or the other 5. They're going to use the one that's most expedient, the easiest to do, whatever. And this is not a laziness thing. This is like, dude, I got a lot of stuff to do. I can do this quickly. It solves the requirement of moving people from A to B. Boom,
Yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah.
Now, if they don't know what we just said, that's a lesser, least optimal. There is a better one. And the better one sometimes requires them to do other things and deal with other people. It's not their fault. And that's really when I tell that to managers, because, when I do the management one first, the first thing they start thinking is, fine, we just get people to play nice together, teach my developers to be SEOs. And then that was sort of the catalyst for our discussion where we were talking about this is a lot of times it's either people are in defensive positions, people aren't enabled to learn this knowledge, because I was on a quest to find out why developers don't know this. And I was actually at PubCon in Florida, and I met a guy who was one of the lead trainers for a whole assortment, like the MSDN training for the Microsoft Developer Platform, all those certifications to manage servers and all this. And I'm like, dude, how come developers don't know this? And he goes, where does that fit in their curriculum? Where does it fit? And that was such an interesting question as we started to go through what do they need to know to keep servers up and to build pages and to do these things. It's somebody else's job. So until we have this knowledge transfer,
you're taking it up to the top level where people are trained. I mean, what we need to overcome is the challenge of getting engineers teams to prioritize SEO fundamentals when they're only being measured on deployment speed and code quality.
Exactly. Or even crazier lines of code. Because I've had dev teams where they I'd say 90% of the code had bugs. And then it's like, because they were measured on volume of code produced, the amount of code that they output, not necessarily volume. They weren't chucking in like 900 extra rows, but the amount of code lines or amount of functions completed. Yeah. There wasn't necessarily a criterion on quality of that code because they had a QA process. They might end up having to redo it, but the criteria was on how many functions they could get out the door and not necessarily how many correct functions can they get out the door. And when you start to have that metric, exactly as you said, things that impede that, their metric of success, are problematic. Or if nobody built that into the spec. We talked about this a couple episodes ago when I was in the meeting in Canada with a company and I just said, hey, none of these new sites are SEO friendly. And they called in the company that built it and said, hey, you guys talk about all your SEO goodness and knowledge. How come there's none of these sites? This guy's telling us none of that SEO goodness has been integrated into the sites. And he goes, well, the scope of work we had didn't have any requirement to be search friendly. And we'll sell you an SEO functionality. I'm not saying this to be evil, that they did anything wrong, but if you can sell something after the fact, why wouldn't you? But the fact that the company didn't know to say this needs to be search friendly, it's the fault of everyone, because what's the incentive for this agency to build this search friendliness in when they can sell a module later? Again, it's everybody's fault. And I think it does start to show this divide, if you will, and again, I took it back to training 101, that when a developer is trained, do they learn these things? Do they learn them at any point in their career? Are they integrated into your workflow? And that's really, what we're starting to talk about when we start to think about, and, I have this was the epiphany, and we've sort of teased this idea of epiphany. So in International Web Mastery, we have I don't even want to call it a course. We have a series of the crazy stuff that's come into my brain over the years that I've broken down. And the first epiphany that I talk about is when I was at IBM and I realized the way I had been approaching search to that point was wrong. That when, in order to fix what I needed to fix at IBM, and the epiphany came because I was put in with the web team. I wasn't in the marketing team. I was in the marketing team, but my desk was in with the web team, and I could hear the sprints. And I'm like, I need to change this. They're like, well, go talk to Steve over here. He manages the templates. and you want to do this, oh, you got to go talk to them. They do that. And when I started realizing that if I could sit down with Steve and say, Steve, when you build a template, can you make sure that we have a title tag? And when we pull it, because we have a rule, every pixel on IBM.com was governed by a rule. And our rule says A, B, and C. And if I can get the rule changed to say it should be D, E, and F, then when you build this template, can you tell it to pull from this place so that we're pulling in the right stuff? And he's like, yeah, I just need to know that. I didn't know. I just know there was a title tag. IBM's guidelines said the title tag should be IBM dash something. And that something was whatever people wrote into the block that got loaded into the database that I pulled from. And the more I started pulling on these threads, the more I was like, oh my God, if I can get the template person to build the template right, if I can get the database that's storing this content to store it and not only know what field to pull from, if I can get the front end people to do this and this and this, and if I can get the writers to put in a why IBM statement, my world changed when I had those epiphanies. And next thing you know, I've got a multi-million-dollar search agency where we're embedding people. And that was our whole focus, was changing the process, getting people to integrate this into their job. And that's what sort of this article talks about is, can we, and we're probably going to do a series of these episodes where we talk about how do we play nice with engineering? How do we play nice with content? And, it's funny, the catalyst of global strategies, my previous agency, and that's not really what I wanted to talk about here, but it's making me think of that. The presentation I gave at PubCon that resulted in this multi-million-dollar agency was about how we flipped the script and integrated all of this SEO stuff into the workflows of other people. And that got the attention of search engines. It got the attention of some of the largest consumer packaged goods in the world. It got the attention of some of the largest websites in the world that said, we need to rethink this. Can you come in and train our teams? Which required understanding their team, which required doing this. And the barriers that we encountered, which we can talk about in later episodes, were exactly that. How do we essentially give somebody something else to do? How do we introduce this? How do we introduce this simple thing of redirects to engineers and to where they go from the easiest thing they can do without talking to anybody to now having to coordinate with the people that manage the redirect file. Back in the day, there was people, Bill, you've been around long enough to know that there was this fictitious number that somebody, I've never got to who made it up, but said you can only have 500 redirects. That's all the system would allow.
I've never heard that, but I've had conversations because there are sites where there's 3,000-4,000 redirects, but I've had conversations with them where they're like, this is going to take too long. Google's not going to follow it. And then you're just talking about a text file.
Right. You're talking about a text file. And then I heard from people, it's going to be overloaded because every request that comes in has to get bounced against that. And it's like, no, it's that request gets bounced against that. And so, and again, you start, do you really know how the web works? Do you really know how our infrastructure works? So it's things like that, right? People were either potentially, but again, going back to the redirect statement, they didn't know. And they didn't know because there was no provision for them to know. There was no reason for them to know necessarily. We can argue that is something they should probably know. Now they can punt it over to the CDN people. Yeah, they should know how to do this because they're the ones managing our redirects. So the engineer probably doesn't have to know this now. But we're not talking about everybody, only people that use a CDN. And again, same with content. If content understood, and you mentioned something, there's already been 3 articles I've seen coming out of this SEMrush report that keywords are dead. And, because again, people are doing like gazillion line prompts and that we no longer have to think about keywords. But at the same method, same statement, these systems are extracting every single word out of the document and making sense out of those words and how they bundle together. So we've not lost keywords. So we still need to work with our content team. And like this article I wrote about, do people need, and should we plant the seed now for having a VP of answers? Resurfacing what I tried to do at companies with this crazy idea of a keyword czar. And this whole premise, that somebody should wrangle this. This is where our content teams can understand when they write things. I do want to do an episode where we talk about an experience I had with a company where we had to train a bunch of writers, and in the way that we took them from, I don't even want to meet with this guy, to, oh my God, this guy just made our life exponentially easier. I mean, they literally didn't want to meet with me because we're not going to have this knucklehead tell me how to write. And so how did we approach that scenario where they didn't even want to hear from us? And that's what I'm saying about this, right? We want to find these synergies where we can come together.
Let me draw a parallel to that. So I think most people would agree that writers realize their value is having people read the content, and the way to get more people to read the content is to rank. But I still struggle, even working with marketers, to get them to realize the benefit of working with PR. It just boggles my mind.
So it's just not a search thing, right? It's how do we get everybody, and that's the whole thing here, right? Going back to our Super Bowl analogy, how do we get all these people to work together? I mentioned when we were talking before, I've been reading this book about, a Marine Corps leadership failure story. And in it, it was the same type of thing because of the arrogance and this sense of elitist that we had within certain communities. We even have this name in the Marine Corps, it's called a pogue. And a pogue is people other than a grunt. So if you're not an infantryman, if you're not carrying a rifle and charging the hill, there's many that believe you have no value in the Marine Corps. And so, these pogues, when you think about it, there's that classic statement that, the battle is won by the infantry, the war is won by logistics. And it's this kind of thing, right? If we don't have content, and this is the thing that I tell people whenever I get into a frustration with any of these teams, look, web team, if we don't get traffic to the site, we don't need your damn website.
Right.
If your content doesn't attract people and get them to convert, we don't need your content.
Ranking keywords, you could rank and get zero traffic. It's about everything.
Exactly.
And everything that's not normally considered SEO. It's about user experience. It's about site performance.
It all comes together.
Content, but every department contributes to that.
And that's the point, right? Every department contributes. And that's what we were saying. So in the article, that was actually the next section was we need to have aggregate KPIs. So we need to think about, and we talked about this last week, ways to get things like one of the questions we had for the startup CEO is what is preventing us technologically from improving our core web vital score, right? Because there's no startup CEO that's not heard somebody beating the door on core web vitals, core web vitals, core web vitals. And if you think about it, why does Google care about this, right? And we're going to talk about this a little bit at the end to tease the new training programs that we have. But why does Google of all people care about this? It's for two reasons. It makes crawling easier and more efficient. And it makes, when people click, like I did a presentation once where I said, the reason Google cares is because people bitch at Google for sending them to a web page that sucked. Like I was more upset with Google sending me to a restaurant that had a PDF for a menu than the restaurant that had a PDF for a menu.
Right. Yeah. You hold Google to the standard of answers and
correct answers.
They can only work with stuff that comes from other people. But,
exactly.
Over the years, they've done a really good job, I think, of cleaning up the web by forcing...
And making it faster.
Yeah.
And what's the fastest way to do some of this? Yes.
Getting rid of a lot of harmful content. And, maybe I should, but when I'm in Google, I don't ever worry about clicking on a link that's going to get me a virus.
Right. Because if you do, then they're at least going to tell you because they have ways to deduce that. And I think that's a key thing, right? Yep. A lot of the malicious stuff. Now, people are trying to do that with paid, and then things like gaming the system with, like, I've had people tell me that they've had employees that missed their flight connection or got delayed for some reason and went to Google, hey, what's the number for KLM or whatever? And then the next thing you know, they're calling this number and they're giving them their credit card and it's not KLM.
Wow.
It's some total scammer. right? Because they did a good job of getting their toll number, their number for KLM, or not just picking on KLM, but other, an airline support system or anybody's support system. And then they're like, yeah, we rebooked you. Oh, that's $400 more. Great. Swipe the card for $400 and you go over to, board the plane. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you don't have a ticket. Like, but I talked to your because they were able to get through, and Google does a good job of capturing that. And again, that we believe they're a good source for answers and information. And so they have done a good job. And so that's one of the reasons why they've sort of given the idea that this might be an SEO metric is, SEOs tend to get stuff done. The moment they say anything or even give the illusion that it might be, a variable, an SEO is going to find a way to weave it into the tickets to get stuff done. So I thought it was very clever on Google's part in doing that. But again, not to derail us on that, the fact that what we were saying is we were telling the startup CEO to ask that question of engineering of what are the barriers to improving that number. So now we've taken something that really only SEOs care about. We've given it as an action item to engineering, and now we've got senior leadership asking about it. These KPIs in many companies over the years, we used to put the burden on some of these metrics on other people. Like 2 companies I worked with, they actually stopped for obvious reasons. They used to put, there was a meta tag for the owner, and it would literally be the company employee who was responsible for that page. And so you could do a report to say, hey, these pages belong to Sally, and this is Sally's traffic from organic search, or this is Sally's aggregate rankings, or this is Sally's revenue. And then we talked last week about how we roped in PR by simply saying, this is the traffic that your links to these pages drove by simply looking at referral links. PR gave us a report saying, hey, these are all of the PR pickups we got on the web. And fine, great. We've got all these. We're not even going to debate, did maybe our link building efforts get them? No, you got them. You talked to the reporter. You got the article in the story. Great. Then all we got to do is pair that up to refer traffic, because guess what? We get that. All the traffic we get from those referral links, we still get. It's not like keyword data. So we can now build a report to say, hey, PR did this amazing outreach. We can do that with external relations, with partners. One of the things that I was talking about, is in our site migration training, I'm talking about, if people that manage like partnerships, I'll give you an example with IBM, we spun out this service or point of sale machines, right? Because we had computers and you simply change the software, and next thing you know, you've got a scanner on a IBM box that you can use at a store. So now we're in the point of sale business, point of sale, like cash register business. And so what did the manager do? He went out and joined all the organizations for point of sale and retail. And then when we looked at the links, because the forums all say, what's your company URL? They put in IBM.com. So even though we had joined like 20 plus organizations that were dead center of what we were doing, every one of them had a link to IBM.com, the homepage. And so we said, hey, no, go back in and tell them to link to our point of sale category page. And sure enough, they did. We paid a premium to be part of these organizations, so they changed it. Some kicking and screaming, oh, we only link to home pages. It's like, okay, let's up our membership and we get a link to where we want it to go to. And then when we did that, we immediately jumped into like the top 3. So obviously we did a bunch of optimization, but almost overnight when those links were changed, and nobody knew. The people selling us the link as part of the membership didn't know. The people joining for the membership didn't know. We had no mechanism to track, did this do anything for us? And so when they knew, and we could unravel these things, and then guess what? We added to the manual that said, hey, if you're joining an organization, you need to put the homepage for the category page that represents the category of the organization. Now, obviously, if we're joining the big companies of the world club, that's going to be IBM.com. But, if it's servers or if it's cloud computing or any of that, we're going to put those category homepages. By simply adding it to the manual was a great opportunity for people to integrate that into their job. Right. And that's the key thing. So, if we can create some KPIs to show And it's interesting. It's funny how many things I start thinking about because you or my wife or somebody says, can you change this report because they want to see how much lift we've had from them making these SEO changes. So now we're down to page level reporting. And then can we see how many keywords are now ranking for this page, or did the traffic improve? Did the stuff, if you told us to add 4 more paragraphs to make it broader and more compelling and interesting, then okay, did any of the words in those 4 paragraphs, are we ranking for them now? Did the overall rankings, did the traffic, and more importantly, did the leads? We're already tracking the leads from that page, but these 2 other elements. And it makes sense, right? If we're telling people, add this goodness, make these changes, then they want to be able to show the resources they put against that move the needle.
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You can also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group. Yeah, I think a big part of having this become ingrained in the organization is that feedback where you can show them, like you had said earlier with PR, look at all of the backlinks you generated. If you could do that for, I don't know, if you're talking to customer service and they give you an article, you can go back to them, 2 or 3 months later and say, look, 600 people found this article that probably didn't call you.
Right.
There's lots of ways to show the value and hopefully get them on board.
So how do we move this forward? How do we get this sort of, this utopian world of integration? And, I've got a couple things in my article, but, what are some of the things, what are some of your recommendations for getting this utopian environment where we're integrated and talking? And you mentioned one right away, let's start with that is, some sort of dashboard or report or, some feedback, if nothing else. Hey, you did X and Y happened and thanks. Not necessarily, hey, we drove 500 extra visits to this page search team. Let's take credit. No, let's share that credit with whomever did it. So that's one, sharing information to where they can see the benefits if they do it. Anything else we think that people should do?
I don't know how you do this, but I think it'd be great if you could create incentives like, what incentives would make engineering teams, prioritize crawl efficiency? I know that you've discussed in the past where you did the Scrungle and you got together and you ran a bunch of tickets, but how could you take that up another level where they're thinking about this before you get in a meeting and you're talking about, low-hanging fruit and specific tickets?
I like that. Or them saying, let's integrate these into these 5 tickets.
Yeah.
That proactive thing. I like that idea of sort of a Scrungle-ish way to incentivize them.
Could you imagine, an engineering manager giving somebody feedback during their yearly review and pat them on the back specifically for something that they've done that they came up with themselves?
Yeah, at TripAdvisor, they had these bobbleheads, and you would get a bobblehead. I think there was 2 sizes of bobbleheads. And I've seen other companies do that if you come up with an idea that drove, I think it was like 1 million or more visits to the site, the person whose idea it was, and then the coders on the coding team that wrote the code for the feature change, they got it. And that was sort of it was started as an SEO incentive to come up with ideas. But then because the coders would get it, there's that point of pride now of now we're a team. We worked on this collaboratively. And then seeing those bobbleheads, you could see who's, delivering on that mission. And I think that's an interesting thing. Obviously, put it into people's performance. At Global Strategies, client success was part of people's KPIs. It was part of their calculation. And so if all of your clients did poorly and we knew that they did poorly because we did poorly, then, it didn't look good for you. And then the downstream of that too, if the tech team supporting you, different things like that, we had a different weighting mechanism, but But I think that's a brilliant way to do it, is incentives for that person, whether it's financial incentives, tchotchke incentives, points toward they're either profit sharing or their promotion or that. I think anything we can do to incentivize and reward collaboration, even something as simple as certificates, that you contributed to this. I mean, that stuff is relatively inexpensive. I think other things we can do. One is, I've done these at a lot of companies. We've built these training modules, cross-functional training. Like one, I don't want to mention the company name, but everybody touching the web had to go through search training so that they understood, whether you're writing content or you're a developer, you had to go through this, just like you're going through sexual harassment or any of the other required training. You could not code. And one went as far as you couldn't get access to like GitHub or whatever until it popped up that you had been certified, not just in, their coding mechanisms and their like, what is it, where you're saving your code. It was like 8 or 9 different areas, and search was one of the required. So I think things like that. We've talked about centers of excellence.
Yep. I want to go back to that earlier point. I've never thought about this, but you could create some sort of a cross-departmental playbook, SEO playbook, and have like shared dashboards and joint workshops. I know we do specific workshops for different teams, but how do you build teams? You create projects where people work together, and maybe you can pick one specific KPI that is cross-departmental.
I like it.
Maybe it's backlinks. Just throw something out there, and then you just do a playbook and a training and a workshop, and you put a whole bunch of cross-functional people in a team, and you give them 6 months.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, we have that. I mean, it's funny how many times we come back to this on these discussions. The catalyst really for this, for the web effectiveness podcast was us talking about how I had a couple people reach out for this web effectiveness guide and sort of manual that I had created for them many years ago. And the idea of dusting that off and having this more, integrated approach. I love that. I'm going to take on that challenge of trying to find a couple KPIs and since I've been in this sort of writing mode, and try to knock those out. I think some of those are really, really good. And I think, again, that was my fourth point, was that shared dashboard. So you just teed it up where people can see that collaborative effort, not just the teams, not just each team, but multiple people. Because I think if you show the collaboration, the ingredients to the stew, and flag it and present it in a way that this is a collaborative outcome, that helps enforce it. And I think it goes all back to, being a leader, and which is, I've been thinking a lot about it with these epiphanies, is you got to walk the walk, and you got to create frameworks, and you've got to create, quality control elements to make sure people are doing things like that. And I think that, that's just one of them, cross-department workshops like you were talking about. How do we get PR and content to play nice together? How do we get...
I'm just thinking out loud, like a specific project could be a new product launch.
Yeah.
You can pull in sales, you can pull in PR, you can pull in events, obviously, writers and engineers, and, you give them a goal together and you hold them all accountable. And then SEO can do this cross-departmental training and work with them on a regular basis, keep them updated with the common KPI for all of them.
Right. And I think, I love the new product because, that's a whole module that we haven't made into a course yet, but I have it, how do we launch products and how do we get people together? Again, you and I both worked with Absolute, where they're launching products and you need all hands on deck to do that. And it is one of these visual things where, you got to leverage the, iconic nature of the bottles and all the good stuff with that. I think that's another brilliant one. And maybe that's another interesting, we should definitely in an upcoming episode talk about, the integration for a product launch, because that circles back to the SEMrush report about things being in, are they in the the LLMs, the intent. If people are aware of a new product, they're not necessarily, I wonder if they're, so there is a search side of this. It's like, if you launch a new blue widget, not blue widget, that's a color, but like, I don't know, super high function widget. If nobody knows about the super high function widget or has a need for a super high function widget, are they going to, and they don't know you make it? There's still an element of search. The point I was trying to make is we need to make sure when this stuff is created going forward that it is findable, indexable, identifiable by, not only traditional search, classical search, but it's got to be ingested by the AI engines and the LLMs so that it can be presented in that function as well.
Yeah, and this goes when I'm just talking about search, but digitally, I mean, you're talking about advertising, you're talking about branding, you're talking about, people that are putting articles in publications, outside of search asking them to. Presentations,
yes, a lot of things.
Shows, there's all kinds of stuff.
All kinds of stuff that people need to think about. So I closed out the article by simply saying, we need to reframe SEO as a team sport. Organizations need to move away from the inefficient, we'll fix it later approach and be more proactive by integrating search more deeply into the ecosystem. And I'm going to take your word, like you were just talking about. Let's just take search out of the equation, have digital. Wherever it is, we just need to weave all these ecosystems together and make them more collaborative. And then my last sentence was the collaborative approach not only improves search performance, but it also creates more efficient workflows and better digital experiences for users by simply weaving all this together and thinking about it a little more holistically and not just doing things within our silos and passing them off for the next part of the assembly line to assemble them. So yeah, let's try to find ways to help people build their digital Super Bowl team.
That's great. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the new training?
So a couple new training. The one that when this goes live, you'll be able to do the pre-sign up. Coming out of a couple of these discussions is we've totally built the first one is SEO for developers. And it's not another SEO thing for developers. It's really thinking about it from a development standpoint. And it's a training that I've done 100 times that even in doing it, I completely rethought it and started out as a teaser. The assignments leading into each module are, you're a Googler, been tasked with X. So we're thinking of this from the other side of the equation. And so it
instead of SEO for developers, it's more of a developer thought-provoking or
exactly
developer thinking mindset for web effectiveness.
Yes, we need to find a way to create a cool name like that. But that's exactly what it is I found like I was actually getting excited because I've been doing this one off forever, despite multiple people wanting us to do it for their company. But I found myself getting excited because as I rethought how we need to present this to developers, not as you need to know this, because you're screwing up our search activities, but really making them want to know and because again, the idea was if we can integrate this into their workflow. So when they build the next template, it has one title tag and it has one of this and it has this and it has that. And the scripts run efficiently and we get speed and we get all the goodness that we go and retrofit later at the beginning. Imagine that. And that's where it comes from. And so how do you teach people this that have probably been through a dozen SEO for developer courses? And it's just, SEO developers by SEOs for SEOs, as opposed to really looking at it from a developer perspective. And, I love this idea of like making them think about the barriers that we know is search are barriers from crawling and indexing and that make them solve the problem or at least think through the problems that these create for search engines and for LLMs. I mean, everybody's talking about a lot of these LLMs can't handle JavaScript. So what are we going to do? I mean, I just saw somebody saying, if you want to be in JavaScript LLMs, in AI answer databases, you need to use pre-render, right? Because you got to make it
Well,
easy,
that goes back to that.
right?
I'm going to put the link in the notes, but that goes back to that video that I was sharing where they basically strip all the code. So why would they
Yeah.
ever, run a script?
How do they get this stuff?
Yeah.
And if they can't get the stuff because A, the stuff doesn't exist, or B, it's there. So that's what this training is about. So I'm really, really like that. And then today, actually, I'm loading hopefully the last of the grand epiphanies of my search evolution. So go check those out. We've had a fair number of people come in, but it's sort of complete now. There's 14 epiphanies. And then I added like 8 bonus things because they weren't unique enough to be epiphanies. So those are the 2 ones. And then we're going to start putting out parts of the site migration. So not only is it the site migration core, but then there's a whole series of specialties. So site migration for rebranding, site migration for acquisitions, site migration for divestitures, site migration for content sunsetting. Well, all of these use the methods in the core, which is the one you take, the core one, but then these specialty ones. Because what we found is there's so much nuance on an acquisition or a divestiture. There's things that we found that our manual, our guide that we were writing was getting too bloated with something nobody's really going to care about, right? If we had people wanting to know about acquisition, right? So let's give an acquisition one. But again, do they need to do the whole course on all the migration stuff? Again, it's, we're going to nickel and dime people and okay, it's same shit, different course. Or is it, we have a core course and then a bunch of specialty modules. We'll see how it gels out, but that's it. That's the training. Let us know if any of this stuff is connecting. We're trying to bring things that are a little more thought provoking. We get some comments occasionally on LinkedIn. So go into our Facebook group and tell us what you like, what you don't like, what you want us to talk about. Let us know on LinkedIn, anywhere on the interwebs. Reach out to us and let us know.
Yeah, and if you want to get a sense of what these paid courses are like, the Epiphanies in Search course is free, and you can find that by just doing a search for Epiphanies in Search. Okay, I think we'll wrap up now. So I hope that you're finding value in our conversations. And if you're enjoying the show, we'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to rate and review the podcast. That helps us rank. And as Bill said, we want to hear from you. Your feedback helps motivate us, keeps us wanting to do these in the future. And you can just do a search and follow International Web Mastery on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X, and let us know what you think. Thanks.
Cool. See you next time.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying hreflang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.